Okay, so we're going to look at how successful Mary's financial policies were, and something in the yellow box for you to consider as you're going through would be the idea of the mid-Tudor crisis. So while you're going through the presentation, maybe add on, if you can, or annotate in your notes whether you think the evidence supports or challenges the notion or the interpretation of crisis. So a few definitions before we look at the topic in more detail. The first one, Court of Augmentations. The court was set up in 1537 to administer the lands and property which had or would come into the hands of the crown after monasteries were dissolved. So this was obviously one of the things that Henry VIII had to deal with after the dissolution of the monasteries, and obviously that was become really important under Mary. So we're going to have a little look at that. The Court of First Fruits and Tenths. Before the break with Rome, first fruits and tenths had been paid directly to the Pope, and the court was set up to administer that these were now paid to the crown. So just in terms of a bit of a recap there, the Court of First Fruits and Tenths was a new source of income which Henry VIII received as a result with break with Rome, one of the things that was key in funding his foreign policy in the 1540s. And finally, musters. So musters was when men and their arms or their weapons who were eligible for military service were brought together for inspection. It wasn't usually done in a very systematic way. So that's the final definition that we need to know. The administration of the revenue is the first thing that we're going to look at. Now, the Duke of Northumberland had set up a commission to investigate ways of reforming the administration of crown finances. It hadn't been possible for him to implement the recommendations that he made before the death of Edward. However, Mary and her councillors implemented these changes in 1554. As a result, the Court of First Fruits and Tenths and the Court of Augmentations came under the control of the Exchequer. And this was an arrangement which lasted for the rest of the Tudor period. And it was much more efficient, so that was a significant improvement. And it also meant as a result that the status of Lord Treasurer was increased, and there was an increase in the value of revenue which was received from Crown lands. Another important administrative development from which Elizabeth really benefited was the introduction in 1558 of a new book of rates. The existing custom rates were really outdated, and the re-evaluations were significant and brought in additional duties being placed on the import of non-essential goods. This led to an increase in custom revenues, and there was no significant amendments which were introduced throughout the reign of Elizabeth, so it's believed that those re-evaluations were a success. And I've just put a quote there for you as well from Alan Smith, who argues that Marian financial reforms were fundamental for Elizabeth's solvency and thus for Elizabethan achievement as a whole. So these things here, like I said at the start, are really useful if we're thinking about this idea of there being a crisis. So if you want to add that on to your notes. So with regards to the coinage, the full-scale recoinage which took place in the early years of Elizabeth's reign in 1560 to 61 was based almost entirely on the plans drawn up by Mary's officials. So they drew up these plans between 1556 and 1558 to deal with the problem that a number of debased coins were still in circulation. The implementation of these plans had been put off because of ongoing difficulties, so war, disease, harvest failure. And I've just put in there an interpretation from a historian which said that Elizabeth could never have tackled the problem of the coinage either as quickly or as effectively as she did had it not been so thoroughly aired amongst the government officials in the immediately preceding years. So it's a really nice judgment there to support this idea that actually Mary's plans, although not completed in the short term, allowed for Elizabeth to have a stronger coinage in her reign. And finally, looking at naval and militia reforms. So the Marian government successfully undertook a complete reorganisation of the administration and finances of the Navy. 6 new ships were built and many other ships were repaired. An annual sum of 14,000 was allocated to the Navy in peacetime, and this figure was reduced by Elizabeth to 12,000. Naval finances were to be administered by a naval treasurer, that's Benjamin Gonson, whose name you can see there, who was answerable to Lord Treasurer Winchester. And this system, which was new and it worked very effectively, there was a clear need to reform the methods in another area by which troops were raised. So the old methods were really out of date. The chosen solution was for Acts of Parliament to create a national system of musters. If you remember, we looked at that definition at the start, with penalties established for absence and for corrupt administration, and to modernise the system for the provision of weapons. Despite their limitations, these acts undoubtedly improved the situation and were definitely an improvement on what had gone on before.